Nicola asks, will Reacher revisit places from the earlier books? Good question, Nicola. And, you know, he sometimes does. He's been to New York several times, obviously, and it's mentioned that he's familiar with other cities like Chicago and so on, and we've seen him in LA a couple of times. In terms of specifically revisiting the very out-of-the-way places in some of the books, I don't suppose he ever would, because he's a guy that always wants to move forward. You know, he's got no interest in revisiting the past. It's always about what's coming next. So unless just purely by coincidence he happened to roll through, I doubt if he'll be back to those places. Vern asks, what is Reacher's biggest strength and biggest weakness? And that is also a good question. And I've thought about this a lot. And honestly, I think his biggest weakness is that he is scared of loneliness. His biggest strength is that he can deal with solitude. And those two things are basically contradictory. So his life is always a tension between being happy on his own and being worried about being forever lonely. And I think that kind of conflict inside him is what drives a lot of his activities. Tracy asks, do I travel to all the locations in the books? Well, I do, absolutely, but not necessarily for the book. You know, it's much more of a reverse order thing, that I will have been somewhere for some other reason, and I will, you know, think this is a cool place, or this is an interesting place, or this has an aspect that is fascinating. And then it can be years later that when I have to write a book, I think, you know what, that place, that could really work. So it's kind of research, but in the reverse order. I don't get the idea and then go to the place to check it out. It's the other way around. For instance, in Never Go Back, there's a scene, a sequence where they're driving through West Virginia to get to Pittsburgh. And I did that. I was at the West Virginia Book Fair a couple of years ago, and then I had to drive to Pittsburgh to the movie set where they were shooting the Jeff Reacher movie. And so that journey was fun. It was a fascinating journey through all kinds of weird and cool places. So it obviously stuck with me, and then it showed up a couple of years later in the new book. Chris wants to know, have I ever considered a story about Reacher as a West Point cadet? And yeah, I really have, although I think it would be a kind of limiting story in a sense, because, you know, what could you do other than just have, like, you know, a murder at West Point or something, and that's a rather old-fashioned kind of a plot that I probably wouldn't want to do. And I think the reality of West Point is a lot less glamorous than people imagine. You know, I've been to West Point, I know plenty of West Point graduates, and it's a very intense technical school. You know, it's more or less like an engineering school, and you know, certainly there's history and military tactics and so on, but it's very focused. And I think that the reality of West Point would kind of disappoint people looking for a dramatic plot. And I think if I then jazzed it up to make West Point really dramatic, then I would get all these alumni complaining, hey, you didn't get that right. So ultimately, I think it's better something left in the past and rather than explored. Mark wants to know, who is my favorite tough guy character from another series? And that's a great question, because there's a lot of good ones. I mean, a lot of good ones. I like Joe Pike that Robert Crais writes about. I like Nick Heller that Joe Finder writes about. There's a lot of great contemporary ones. But I think, honestly, the answer, I'd have to go back to the past, and it would be Travis McGee, the John D. MacDonald series. Travis McGee, 21 books, each one of them with a color in the title. And to me, that is not only the best tough guy series, it's probably the best series. You know, it's quite remarkable, a 21-book series without any real weak points, done in a way that is not overtly dramatic. I think the biggest magic of MacDonald is that nothing much happens on page 1, nothing much happens on page 2. By page 3, you cannot put the book down. Now, how does it do that? It's just terrific.